Good morning. Welcome back for a little bit of a history lesson. I was reading in my kids' history book the other day, and I thought, you know what? We all could use a little remembrance of what happened, of how America got established. And things that I learned back in 8th grade when I had to take a constitutional test, that's stuff that I don't really think about in the day-to-day world, and how many of you remember taking a constitutional test and having to study in 8th grade our constitution and our government? I do. But I don't know if we're doing that these days. Do our children really get the education of what history was like back then? It is good for you parents to start reading the books that your children are given at school so that you will know what they are being taught. The books change around in the 1960s, and you might want to look back and see what did you learn versus what they're learning today. However, today brings me to how America got started. Now, not all the way back to Christopher Columbus and all the adventures of the French and the Spanish and the wars that happened, but I want to go speed up into history about the time they were about to declare independence. You see, their 13 colonies were established and still were being run by England. King George III was the king at the time. But what ended up happening was the English settlers in America were not given the rights that the Englishmen had in England. Yes, they had the right of freedom to religion and to make laws and to be a part of those laws, but they weren't being treated fairly, so this caused a little bit of division in the colonies. People just wanted to be treated like Englishmen. Others began to think, well, if they don't give us our freedom, what are we going to do? The colonists speak out, and although there were some colonists who agreed with England, many colonists felt that England was treating them wrongly. Men from 9 colonies decided to hold a meeting in New York. This meeting, it was decided that the colonists should complain to the king. At last, the British government felt forced to drop the stamp back. You see, what England was doing was posing taxes on the colonists in America because they had to pay for, war. King George was wanting to raise money and capital, so he was doing it through the colonists. Well, it wasn't fair because he was telling them that if they produced iron, they had to send it back to England to get things made, and then they had to buy it at higher prices. So the English in America were beginning to see that they were being kept in a lower income class, that even the clothes and stuff like that they couldn't buy unless they bought everything from England. So there was this tightening of the English government on America, especially with taxes. New taxes were being placed. Eventually, as you probably remember, the Boston Tea Party was because England decided to wipe out the taxes but kept the tax on tea. So this was after the Boston Massacre. In the chilly December of 1773, about 50 colonists dressed up that looked like Indians and carried tomahawks, and they boarded 3 ships that were carrying the 340 chests of tea. Each chest was smashed open, and they destroyed them and sent them into the ocean. This is the event called the Boston Tea Party. News of the Boston Tea Party spread quickly through other colonies, and many colonists cheered the people of Boston for their courage. Now you have to remember, England had closed the harbors of Boston, and they were trying to enforce their taxes by not letting the ships come in and out. So Boston would, under what the king thought, would starve, and he was being cruel to them. And so, but what he didn't realize is the other colonies would come in and help. Okay, so they sent supplies through the land to them. And so soon it got to the point where it says, how can we protect ourselves from the regulation that the government of England has no right to impose upon us? One of the patriots suggested the representation of each colony to meet together in Philadelphia to decide what to do. So the pressure from England was getting super great. Like I said, that they had closed off the Boston harbor. It was just evident that they were going into a place where the king wanted to establish himself and all the taxes, but the Englishmen were not getting fair representation. So the first Continental Congress met. 50 men met in Philadelphia in September of 1774. They all agreed that England was unfair to their colonies, but they did not agree about what to do. Most men only wanted England to be fair to the colonists. Only a few had decided that it was time for America to be independent. Finally, they made up a list of complaints. They were supposed to have the same rights of all Englishmen, and that the king acted as though they had no rights at all. The colonists asked that their rights as Englishmen be respected. Then they agreed that the people of Massachusetts should not obey the laws that the England had enforced upon her. To show what they meant business, the colonists agreed not to buy the goods made in England. This meeting was called the First Continental Congress. If England does not listen, then we will return in May to hold a Second Continental Congress. So, what happened? Well, King George sent warships and soldiers to the colonies. He was determined to force the colonists to obey. The British warships and soldiers set up in the colonies. They began to drill and train soldiers. Colonists began to hide gunpowder and ammunition. Many Massachusetts men called themselves Minutemen because they said they would be ready to fight at the minute's notice. Well, fight for what? They were willing to fight for their rights as Englishmen. They thought that once King George realized they made business, that he would give them their rights. Meanwhile, in Virginia, a young man named Patrick Henry gave a stirring speech which began to change the minds of the colonists. In his argument for fighting for independence, Patrick Henry said, "Gentlemen may cry peace and peace, but there is no peace. Why stand here idle? What is it that gentlemen wish? What do they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Those who, like Patrick Henry, now wanted America to be free from England were called patriots. Those who remained loyal to England were called loyalists. So again, there was this division of those who just wanted their rights and those who now wanted their independence. So there was a few things that were happening, and the British general heard that the Patriots had stored guns and ammunition in the town of Concord, so he also knew that the Patriot leaders were staying in the town of Lexington. The British began making plans to march to Lexington and conquer, and were their hope to capture the Patriot leader and capture the Patriot supply of guns and ammunition. Fortunately, a Patriot heard of the British plan. If the Minutemen were warned, perhaps they could stop the British. Paul Revere, a Patriot from Boston, and another man named William Dawes jumped on their horses and rode through the countryside. It was night. To waken and warn the colonists, they shouted, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" When the British soldiers reached Lexington, they met a group of brave Minutemen. Suddenly, the silence of Lexington was shattered by a sound of a gunshot. No one knows who fired the shot, but it started the American Revolution. From this shot would come the fight for liberty that the whole world will watch in interest. And from this shot would come the creation of a new country, which would play a great part in world history. Because that one shot changed history, it was also called the shot around the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a famous American poet, wrote about it. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. There once the embattled farmer stood, of fire, and fire the shot that heard around the world. After the First Battle of Lexington, the British marched to Concord, but the Minutemen were able to push back them and the war had begun. But the purpose of the war was still not clear. Where were the colonists going to fight for their rights as Englishmen, or were they going to fight for their independence? Back with round 2.